Dr. Eleanor Hayes wiped the sweat from her brow as she carefully sorted through the dusty archive boxes. The humidity of Savannah in August made the basement of the Historical Society feel like a sauna. But after 3 years of researching post-Civil War mourning practices, she couldn't afford to rush. Her grant funding was running low, and she needed something substantial to justify an extension. "I think I've got something interesting here, Mark," she called to her research assistant, who was cataloguing items at a nearby table. Mark Sanders glanced up from his laptop. "Please tell me it's not another inventory list of funeral garments," he said with a weary smile. Eleanor gently lifted a small, velvet-covered album from a box labeled Whitaker Estate, 1860-1870. The binding was cracked, but the gold embossing still caught the dim light. "Remembrances. This looks like a personal collection," she said, carefully opening the first brittle page. Post-mortem photography was common then, but private albums are rare finds. Mark walked over as Eleanor turned the yellowed pages. Each held a carefully mounted photograph of deceased individuals, arranged to appear peacefully sleeping. Adults in chairs, children on beds, babies in their mother's arms. Standard Victorian memento mori. "Creepy as these are, they're actually beautiful," Mark observed. "The care they took to honor their dead." Eleanor nodded, examining each image with her magnifying glass. She stopped at a photograph of what appeared to be a funeral service. A simple wooden coffin was surrounded by somber-faced mourners in a parlor. "Wait," she whispered, leaning closer. "Look at this one." The photograph showed about a dozen people gathered around an open casket. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her magnifying glass over the coffin. "I need to scan this immediately," she said, her voice suddenly tense. "What is it?" Mark asked, trying to see what had caught her attention. Eleanor carefully removed the photograph from its mounting and walked briskly to their digital scanner. "Look at the face in the coffin," she said, as she prepared the high-resolution scan. Mark peered over her shoulder as the image appeared on the computer screen. Eleanor zoomed in on the coffin, enhancing the resolution. "That can't be right," Mark whispered. The dead man's face, unlike the peaceful expressions of the other corpses, bore what appeared to be a wide, unnatural smile. "The date on the back says April 1866, Eleanor said, 1 year after the war ended." Mark stared at the image. Could it be deterioration of the photograph? Maybe just how the face settled after death? Eleanor shook her head. "I've never seen a rictus that looks like this. And look at the eyes. They appear partially open." As they stared at the enlarged image on the screen, a chill ran through the stuffy room. The face in the coffin had an expression that seemed too deliberate, too aware. The lips were pulled back in what couldn't be mistaken for anything but a grin. "There's an inscription," Eleanor said, carefully turning over the original photograph. In faded brown ink, someone had written, "Jacob Mercer laid to rest, may God have mercy." "I've never heard of him," Mark said. "But that's not a typical funeral inscription." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I think we need to find out who Jacob Mercer was, and why someone would pray for mercy for him, or from him, even after death." The following morning, Eleanor arrived at the Historical Society before it opened to the public. She had barely slept, the image of Jacob Mercer's grinning face intruding whenever she closed her eyes. She'd spent hours searching online databases for any mention of him, with no success. The Society's director, Dr. Howard Blackwood, met her at the entrance, keys jingling in his hand. In his 70s, with a shock of white hair and perpetually ink-stained fingers, he was a walking encyclopedia of Savannah's history. "You sounded quite excited on the phone," he said, unlocking the door, though disturbed might be a better word. Eleanor showed him the scanned image on her tablet. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Howard studied it carefully, adjusting his glasses. Post-mortem photography was quite common, but this is unusual. The expression doesn't look natural. "Exactly," Eleanor said. "I need access to the city's death records from 1866. Howard led her to the records room. Most official documents from that period were destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1898, but we have church records, newspaper archives. For hours, Eleanor and Mark pored over fragile newspapers and parish death registries. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor's eyes were burning from strain, but she refused to take a break. "Here!" Mark called out suddenly. "Savannah Morning News, April 17th, 1866. Eleanor rushed to his side. In the small notices section was a brief paragraph. "The body of Mr. Jacob Mercer, 38, was laid to rest yesterday at Laurel Grove Cemetery following services at his sister's home on Abercorn Street. Mr. Mercer, recently returned from medical studies in Europe, succumbed to fever after a brief illness. He is survived by his sister, Mrs. Catherine Wells." "That's it," Eleanor frowned. "For someone from a prominent enough family to have a photographer at his funeral, that's unusually brief." "Maybe the family wanted privacy," Howard suggested, having joined them after his morning meetings. Eleanor shook her head. "In 1866, Savannah, prominent families used funeral announcements to display their social standing. This is barely an acknowledgement." Howard tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "The Wells family. Catherine Wells. That name sounds familiar." He disappeared into his office and returned with a leather-bound volume. "Local folklore collections," he explained. "Not academic sources, but sometimes they preserve stories that official records omit." He flipped through the pages, stopped, and read silently for a moment. His expression darkened. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. Howard cleared his throat. "There's a story here about a house on Abercorn Street that remained empty for decades because locals believed it was cursed. It supposedly belonged to a woman named Catherine Wells, whose brother was rumored to have conducted unusual experiments." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of experiments?" "It doesn't specify, but there were whispers about grave robbing and attempts to reverse death itself." Mark laughed nervously. "Like a real-life Dr. Frankenstein." Howard didn't smile. "After the Civil War, Savannah was rebuilding. Many doctors who had seen the horrors of battlefield medicine became obsessed with finding ways to cheat death." Eleanor stared again at the smiling face in the coffin. "The notation says he studied medicine in Europe. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published in 1818. What if he took inspiration from it? You're not seriously suggesting he was experimenting with reanimation?" Mark asked incredulously. Eleanor looked up from the photograph. "I'm suggesting we need to find Catherine Wells's house and any records she might have kept of her brother's work." Howard closed the book. "The house was demolished in the 1920s, but Catherine Wells lived until 1912. She might have left papers, correspondence." "And I know just where to look," Eleanor said, her academic excitement temporarily overriding her unease. "The University Archive has a collection of personal papers from prominent Savannah families of that era. The Wells family might be included." As they gathered their materials to head to the university, Mark paused, looking again at the grinning face on the screen. "What if it's just photographic deterioration or a hoax?" he asked hopefully. Eleanor considered this. "Then we've lost nothing but time. But if Jacob Mercer was experimenting with reanimation and something went wrong, then what?" Mark pressed. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Finally she said, "Then we need to make sure he's still in his grave." The university archives were housed in a modern building that contrasted sharply with the historic campus around it. Inside, the temperature was carefully controlled to preserve the delicate documents, providing welcome relief from Savannah's oppressive heat. The archivist, a thin woman named Patricia Reeves, listened to their request with growing interest. "The Wells family papers. We do have a small collection, donated in the 1960s by a distant relative. They haven't been fully catalogued yet." She disappeared into the stacks and returned pushing a cart with 4 acid-free boxes. These contain personal correspondence, household accounts, and some miscellaneous items. Standard access rules apply. No pens, no food or drink. Document everything you remove from folders. Eleanor thanked her and donned the required cotton gloves. Each box was labeled by decade, from the 1860s through the 1890s. Let's start with the earliest, she told Mark. Look for any mentions of Jacob or medical studies. For 2 hours, they carefully examined faded letters and documents. Catherine Wells had kept meticulous household accounts, noting every expenditure down to individual candles purchased. There were letters from friends, invitations to social events, and church bulletins. Nothing unusual so far, Mark said, gently returning a bundle of correspondence to its folder. Catherine Wells seems to have been a perfectly ordinary, if well-off, Savannah widow. Eleanor nodded, feeling a mix of disappointment and relief. Maybe the photograph was simply an optical illusion or deterioration after all. Then she opened a small envelope tucked between 2 larger folders. Inside was a letter dated March 12th, 1866, approximately 1 month before Jacob Mercer's death. The handwriting was jagged, urgent, unlike the neat penmanship of Catherine's other correspondence. "I think I found something," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark moved his chair closer as she began to read. "My dearest sister, I write to you in great excitement and some trepidation. The formula shows promise beyond my most ambitious hopes." Subject R responded to stimulation for nearly 3 minutes before lapsing back. "I believe with refinement, particularly the electrical component, success is within reach. I know you disapprove, but consider the implications. No more mothers burying children. No more widows. No more senseless losses like we witnessed in the war. I do this for us all. I have acquired new specimens from M. They arrive tonight. If all goes well, I shall have conclusive results within the fortnight. Tell no one of my work. The small minds of Savannah would not understand that I reach for the divine not out of hubris, but mercy. Your devoted brother Jacob." Eleanor and Mark stared at each other in silence. Finally, Mark spoke. "Specimens? Subject R? This sounds like human experimentation," Eleanor finished grimly. "And M must be a supplier, a grave robber, perhaps." She carefully searched the remaining contents of the envelope and found a smaller folded note. "There's more." This note was dated April 3rd, 1866, just 2 weeks before Jacob's reported death. "Catherine, burn everything. M talks too freely when in his cups. I fear discovery." The last subject showed unprecedented response. Too much response. "Something is wrong with the formula. I've locked the laboratory but cannot destroy my notes yet, too close to understanding the error. If anything happens to me, you must seal the basement. Tell no one of my work. J." Eleanor felt a chill despite the controlled temperature of the archive. "He was afraid of something, or someone found out what he was doing," Mark suggested. "Body snatching was a serious crime." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "Too much response. That doesn't sound like he was worried about legal troubles." She carefully returned the letters to their envelope and continued searching. The next box contained correspondence from April through December 1866. Inside was a thick folder labeled simply Jacob Arrangements. It contained funeral receipts, condolence letters, and a list of funeral attendees. At the bottom of the stack was a letter from a Dr. William Sullivan, dated April 16th, 1866, the day of Jacob's funeral. "My dear Mrs. Wells, as agreed, I have listed the cause of death as fever. The certificate has been filed with the proper authorities. No further examination will be conducted. I must stress again the importance of a sealed casket at the service tomorrow. The damage to the facial muscles cannot be adequately concealed and would only cause you further distress. I have disposed of the contents of his laboratory as instructed. May God grant you peace in this difficult time. With deepest sympathies, Dr. William Sullivan." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she read the letter aloud to Mark. "Damage to the facial muscles?" Mark repeated. "But in the photograph, the casket is open, and his face isn't damaged." It's smiling, which means either Dr. Sullivan was lying about the damage, Eleanor said slowly, or what we're seeing in that photograph isn't damage. It's contraction of the facial muscles. After death, Mark looked skeptical. Maybe not completely after, Eleanor whispered. What if his experiments worked, at least partially? What if Jacob Mercer experienced his own formula's effects? They sat in silence, the implications hanging in the air between them. We need to find his grave, Eleanor finally said. The letter mentioned Laurel Grove Cemetery. Mark checked his watch. It's almost 5. The cemetery closes at sunset. Eleanor began carefully repacking the documents. We'll go first thing tomorrow. For now, let's see if we can find any more information about what happened after the funeral. As they continued their search, neither noticed Patricia watching them from between the shelving units, her expression troubled by what she had overheard. The following morning dawned grey and humid, with low clouds promising rain. Eleanor and Mark met at the entrance to Laurel Grove Cemetery, one of Savannah's oldest burial grounds. The sprawling cemetery was divided into 2 sections. Laurel Grove North for white burials and Laurel Grove South for African Americans. According to the cemetery records, Jacob Mercer should be in Section H, near the Wells family plot, Eleanor said, consulting the map provided by the cemetery office. They walked in silence down the narrow paths lined with ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. The weathered headstones and mausoleums created a labyrinth of marble and granite monuments to the dead. It's beautiful in a melancholy way, Mark observed, his voice hushed as if not to disturb the residents. They found the Wells family plot marked by a substantial obelisk listing family members. Catherine Wells' grave was there, along with her husband and children. But there was no marker for Jacob Mercer. That's strange, Eleanor frowned, checking the map again. He should be here, next to Catherine. They searched the surrounding area, checking each headstone carefully. Finally, about 20 yards from the family plot, they found a simple stone marker partially obscured by overgrown grass. The inscription was weathered but still legible. Jacob Mercer, 1828-1866, requiescat in pace. Why would he be buried separately from the family? Mark wondered aloud. Eleanor knelt to examine the grave more closely. And why such a modest marker for someone from a prominent family? She brushed away the grass and dirt from the base of the headstone and noticed something unusual. There's a metal band around the perimeter of the grave. Mark knelt beside her. You're right. It looks like iron, maybe. Old, but not original to the burial. Eleanor stood, surveying the grave with growing unease. In some folklore traditions, iron is used to contain supernatural entities, to keep something in or out. A light drizzle began to fall, quickly turning into a steady rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Perfect horror movie weather, Mark joked nervously, pulling up his jacket hood. Eleanor didn't smile. She was remembering Catherine's letter about sealing the basement, about her brother's experiments going wrong, about too much response. We need ground-penetrating radar, she said suddenly, to see if the coffin is still intact. Mark stared at her. You can't be serious. That would require permits, cemetery approval, funding. I know people in the archaeology department, Eleanor interrupted. They use GPR for non-invasive site surveys all the time. We could present it as a study of 19th century burial practices. Before Mark could respond, a voice called out behind them. You won't find him there. They turned to see an elderly groundskeeper watching them from beneath a large black umbrella. His weathered face suggested decades of working among the dead. Excuse me, Eleanor asked, walking toward him. Whoever you're looking for, the man said, gesturing to the grave. That one's empty. Eleanor and Mark exchanged glances. How do you know that? Mark asked. The old man shrugged. Been working here 43 years. You learn things. That grave was opened in 1898 during the yellow fever epidemic. They needed every available plot. But when they dug it up, there was nothing there. Nothing, Eleanor repeated. No remains at all. That's the story. Before my time, of course. But my grandfather worked here then, and he told my father, who told me. The old man's eyes narrowed. Why are you so interested in an empty grave? Eleanor hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. We're researching unusual burial practices after the Civil War. We found a photograph of this man's funeral that showed some anomalies. The groundskeeper's expression changed subtly. The smiling corpse. You found that old picture? Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. You know about it? The old man nodded slowly. There are stories about this part of the cemetery. Strange sounds at night. Visitors who feel watched. Most of the old-timers won't work this section after dark. Thunder cracked loudly overhead, making them all jump. The rain intensified. You should leave, the groundskeeper said, turning to go. Cemetery closes early when there's lightning. Wait, Eleanor called after him. What happened to him, to Jacob Mercer? The old man paused but didn't turn around. Some questions are better left unanswered, especially in a place like this. But if you must know, check the old sanitarium records. Mercer wasn't buried here because he didn't die on the day of his funeral. With that cryptic statement, he walked away, disappearing among the tombstones and rain. Eleanor and Mark hurried back to the cemetery entrance, both soaked despite their rain gear. In the car, they sat in stunned silence as the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. An empty grave, Mark finally said. And what did he mean about the sanitarium? Eleanor started the engine, her mind racing. There was only one psychiatric hospital operating in Savannah at that time, the Georgia State Sanitarium. If Jacob Mercer didn't die, you think he was committed? Mark asked. But why fake his death? Eleanor pulled out of the cemetery parking lot. Think about it. If his experiments caused too much response, what if he tested his reanimation formula on himself and something went terribly wrong? What if he couldn't die? The rain hammered on the roof of the car as they drove through Savannah's suddenly gloomy streets. The sanitarium records would be at the State Archives in Atlanta, Mark said. We'd need special permission to access medical files, even historical ones. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel tightly. Then we'll get permission, because I need to know what happened to Jacob Mercer, and I need to know if whatever he created died with him, or is still out there waiting. As if in response, lightning flashed, illuminating the rain-slicked road ahead, and for just a moment, casting everything in a stark, unforgiving light. 2 days later, Eleanor and Mark sat in the reading room of the Georgia State Archives in Atlanta. After multiple calls to colleagues and a hastily written research proposal, they had secured access to the historical records of the Georgia State Sanitarium, renamed Central State Hospital in the early 20th century. The archivist placed a box of deteriorating folders on the table before them. These are admission records from 1866 through 1870, she explained. Patient case files are restricted, even historical ones, but admission logs and annual reports are available for research. Eleanor thanked her, and once the archivist had returned to her desk, they began carefully examining the fragile documents. April 1866, Eleanor murmured, running her finger down a column of faded handwriting. Here, April 18th. Patient number 217, admitted under the name John Doe, male, approximately 40 years of age, transferred from Savannah under special arrangements with Dr. William Sullivan. The same doctor who wrote to Catherine about Jacob's fever, Mark noted. Eleanor continued reading. Patient exhibits extreme agitation, self-mutilation tendencies, and an unusual physiological condition that requires further study. Isolated in Ward D by order of Dr. Hargrove, chief physician. Self-mutilation, Mark repeated. That could explain the damage to facial muscles, Sullivan mentioned. Eleanor flipped through more pages until she found the quarterly report for that period. Listen to this. Patient 2R17 continues to present unique challenges. Conventional treatments prove ineffective. Patient does not sleep, requires 4-point restraints at all times, and has injured 3 attendants. The unusual rigidity of the facial muscles persists, giving the appearance of a constant grimace or smile. Mark shuddered visibly. So Jacob Mercer didn't die. He was locked away because of what he'd done to himself. Eleanor nodded grimly, and Dr. Sullivan helped cover it up, probably to protect both Jacob and his sister from scandal. They continued searching through the records, finding periodic mentions of patient Dr. 217 over the next several years. The reports grew increasingly clinical and detached, documenting failed treatments and the patient's unnatural constitution. A report from December 1869 noted, "Patient number 217 transferred to basement isolation. Subject's vocalizations disturb other patients. Muscle contraction continues to intensify rather than diminish with time. Recommend permanent isolation." The final mention came in an 1871 administrative memo regarding patient number 217, Ward D, basement. After consultation with the board of directors and state officials, it has been determined that the situation requires extraordinary measures. The patient will be transferred to the secure facility on Sapello Island under military escort. All records of this transfer are to be sealed by order of Governor Bullock. Staff with knowledge of patient number 217 are reminded of their confidentiality oaths. Eleanor sat back, her mind racing. Sapello Island. That's off the Georgia coast, about 60 miles south of Savannah. What was there in the 1870s? Mark asked. I'm not sure, Eleanor admitted. It's been a plantation, a research facility. I know the University of Georgia has a Marine Research Institute there now. Mark pulled out his laptop. Let me see what I can find. While he searched online, Eleanor continued examining the archives, looking for any other references to patient 217 or Sapello Island. She found nothing until she reached a folder of correspondence between hospital administrators. A letter dated August 17th, 1898, the year the cemetery worker had mentioned, caught her attention. Regarding your inquiry about former patient number 217, I regret to inform you that all records of the Sapello Island facility were destroyed in the hurricane of 1893. The island was largely abandoned after the storm, and we have no information about the patient's ultimate disposition. As this matter is still considered classified by state authorities, I would advise against further investigation. Some doors are best left closed. Respectfully, Dr. Edmund Pierce, Director. Mark, Eleanor said quietly, the hurricane of 1893 was one of the deadliest in Georgia history. It killed thousands along the coast. If Jacob Mercer was being held on Sapello Island, he could have escaped in the chaos. Mark finished, looking up from his laptop. I found something about the island. In the 1870s, part of it was used as a quarantine station for ships coming into Georgia ports. There are also rumors that the military maintained a small facility there for special cases, prisoners or patients too dangerous or unusual for conventional institutions. Eleanor felt a chill run through her, and if the facility was destroyed in 1893, and if Jacob Mercer couldn't die, Mark added hesitantly. They sat in silence, the implications too disturbing to voice aloud. Finally, Eleanor spoke. We need to go to Sapello Island. There might be ruins, local stories, something to tell us what happened after 1893. Mark looked uncertain. Eleanor, this is getting... I don't know, aren't we taking this a bit far? Even if Jacob Mercer conducted bizarre experiments and ended up institutionalized, that was over 150 years ago. Eleanor pulled out her tablet and showed him the enhanced image of Jacob's grinning face in the coffin. Does this look like someone who would stay quietly in a grave or an institution? His formula did something to him, something that doctors in the 1860s couldn't understand or reverse. She began gathering their materials. I'm going to Sapello Island tomorrow. You don't have to come if you don't want to. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Of course I'm coming. Someone has to make sure you don't end up as the protagonist in a horror novel. As they prepared to leave, the archivist approached their table. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. Eleanor hesitated, then asked, "Do you have any personal accounts or diaries from staff who worked at the Sapello Island facility in the late 19th century?" The archivist's expression changed subtly. "That's an unusual request. Most researchers don't even know about that place." "So there are records," Eleanor pressed. The woman glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Not in the public archives, but there's a collection of personal papers donated by the family of Dr. Luther Jenkins, who worked on Sapello from 1880 to 1893. They're still being processed, not officially available yet." She hesitated, then added, "My grandfather used to tell stories about Sapello. He said there were parts of the island where locals wouldn't go, even today, places where the soil is salted so nothing will grow." Eleanor felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "Can we see Dr. Jenkins' papers?" The archivist checked her watch. "We close in 20 minutes, but if you come back tomorrow morning, I might be able to arrange a brief look, unofficially." As they left the archives, the late afternoon sky was darkening with another approaching storm. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being pulled deeper into something they might regret. "What are we really doing here, Eleanor?" Mark asked as they walked to their hotel. "This started as research into mourning practices, and now we're chasing ghost stories about a man who might have found a way to cheat death." Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him. "I don't know exactly what we're doing anymore, but I know that photograph shows something impossible, and impossible things demand explanation." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they continued walking, both lost in thought about what awaited them on Sapello Island. The ferry to Sapello Island left from a small dock in McIntosh County. Eleanor and Mark stood on the deck as the mainland receded behind them, the morning sun glinting off the water of Doughboy Sound. They had spent the morning at the State Archives, where the archivist had surreptitiously allowed them 30 minutes with Dr. Jenkins' personal papers. What they found had only deepened the mystery. Jenkins' journal entries from 1889 described a single patient kept in a specially constructed chamber beneath the quarantine facility. The subject continues to confound medical understanding. Despite complete absence of normal metabolic functions, cellular activity persists. Facial paralysis has progressed to complete rigidity in a grotesque simulation of mirth. Subject no longer attempts speech, but emits occasional vocalizations that have adverse effects on staff morale. His final entry, dated August 26, 1893, just days before the hurricane, was brief and disturbing. "God forgive us for what we've done, and God help us all if the chamber does not hold." Now, as the ferry approached Sapello, Eleanor studied the lush, tree-covered island. Most of it was now a nature reserve and research facility, with a small community of descendants of enslaved people who had worked the plantations. The Historical Society arranged for us to meet with Mr. James Bailey, Eleanor told Mark. "He's 92 years old and has lived on the island his entire life. If anyone knows the old stories, it would be him." A university van met them at the dock and drove them along the island's single-paved road. The driver, a graduate student named Alicia, was curious about their research. "Not many historians come looking for information about the quarantine station," she remarked. "It was mostly dismantled after the hurricane of 1893. "Do you know exactly where it was located?" Eleanor asked. Alicia nodded. "On the south end of the island. There's nothing left but foundations now, and they're mostly overgrown. The area's off limits, unstable ground." She glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Bailey asked me to bring you to his house first. He doesn't get many visitors, so he's excited to talk to you." James Bailey lived in a modest house surrounded by ancient oak trees. Despite his age, he greeted them on the porch with a firm handshake and alert eyes. "So you're interested in the old quarantine station," he said after they had settled with glasses of sweet tea. "Not many people ask about that place anymore." Eleanor explained their research as simply as possible, mentioning only that they were studying medical practices after the Civil War and had found references to a special facility on Sapello. Mr. Bailey nodded slowly. My grandfather worked there as a young man, tending the grounds. He didn't talk about it much, but when he did, the old man's voice trailed off. What did he tell you? Mark prompted gently. He said there was a building separate from the main quarantine station, small, made of stone, with iron bars and doors. The white doctors and soldiers were the only ones allowed inside, but my grandfather said he could sometimes hear noises coming from it. Not human noises. Eleanor leaned forward. Did he ever mention a specific patient? Someone who might have been transferred there from a sanitarium around 1871? Mr. Bailey's expression grew serious. There's an old story passed down in my family. About a man who couldn't die. The white folks called him the smiling man, because his face was frozen in a grin, even though his eyes— The old man shuddered slightly. They said his eyes showed he was in torment. Mark and Eleanor exchanged glances. What happened to him? Eleanor asked. The story goes that during the Great Hurricane of 1893, the stone building was damaged. The soldiers tried to secure the patient, but in the chaos of the storm, something went wrong. My grandfather never said exactly what happened, only that there was screaming and then gunshots. Mr. Bailey took a sip of his tea before continuing. After the storm, they found bodies of soldiers and doctors, but never found the patient. Some said he drowned in the storm surge. Others said he escaped. And what do you think happened? Eleanor asked quietly. The old man studied her for a long moment. I think some questions don't have good answers, Dr. Hayes. But I'll tell you this. There's a part of this island, about a mile from the old quarantine station, that none of the locals will go near. We call it the dead zone. Nothing grows there, not even weeds. And sometimes, especially during storms, people say they've seen a figure standing at the edge of the trees watching. A heavy silence fell over the porch. Finally, Mark spoke. Could you show us these places? The quarantine station ruins and the other area? Mr. Bailey shook his head firmly. I can have Alicia drive you to the ruins, though there's not much to see. But I won't take you to the dead zone, and I'd advise you not to go looking for it. Some things are best left undisturbed. Despite their questions, Mr. Bailey would say no more about the dead zone, changing the subject to the island's more pleasant history. After an hour, they thanked him for his time and returned to the waiting van. Did you learn anything useful? Alicia asked as they drove away. Mr. Bailey mentioned a place called the Dead Zone, Eleanor said. Do you know about it? Alicia's hands tightened visibly on the steering wheel. That's just an old island superstition. There's a clearing in the forest on the southeast side where not much grows, probably just poor soil conditions or runoff from the old quarantine chemicals. But the locals avoid it, Mark pressed. Alicia hesitated. Look, I'm a scientist. I don't believe in ghost stories. But yes, the locals avoid it. And honestly, most of the research staff do too. It's unsettling, even in daylight. She drove them to the ruins of the quarantine station, now little more than crumbling stone foundations, partially reclaimed by the forest. Eleanor and Mark explored carefully, finding nothing of note until they reached the southernmost part of the ruins. This must be the separate building Mr. Bailey mentioned, Eleanor said, examining a more substantial foundation, with what appeared to be the remains of iron fixtures embedded in the stone. It's small, but the walls were much thicker than the other structures. Mark knelt to examine a piece of rusted metal protruding from the ground. This looks like part of a restraint system, heavy duty. They spent an hour documenting the ruins, taking photographs and notes. As the afternoon progressed, the sky began to darken with approaching clouds. We should head back soon, Alicia called from where she waited by the van. Storms roll in quickly here, and the last ferry leaves at 5. Eleanor looked at Mark. We need to see the dead zone before we go. Mark hesitated, then nodded. Alicia, he called. Could you show us the clearing Mr. Bailey mentioned? Just for a few minutes? Alicia looked uncomfortable. I really don't think— Please, Eleanor interrupted. It's important for our research. We won't stay long. After a moment of internal struggle, Alicia sighed. Fine, but we make it quick. And if I say we leave immediately. No arguments. They drove about a mile east. Then Alicia parked the van at the edge of a dense forest. It's about a quarter-mile walk from here. Stay close. It's easy to get disoriented in these woods. As they followed a narrow, overgrown path, Eleanor noticed the forest growing quieter with each step. The usual chorus of birds and insects gradually faded until an unnatural silence surrounded them. Is it always this quiet here? She whispered to Alicia. The graduate student nodded grimly. That's one of the reasons people avoid this area. No wildlife. Even the bugs stay away. After about 10 minutes of walking, the trees thinned, and they emerged at the edge of a roughly circular clearing about 50 yards across. Unlike the lush vegetation surrounding it, the clearing was barren, not just empty of trees, but devoid of any plant life. The ground was dark, almost black, and appeared damp despite the lack of recent rain. This is it, Alicia said, stopping at the edge of the trees, the dead zone. Eleanor took a step forward, but Alicia grabbed her arm. Don't go in there, not with a storm coming. Why not? Mark asked, staring at the desolate clearing. Island superstition, Alicia replied, but her scientific detachment seemed to have abandoned her. They say it's most dangerous during storms. That's when he's most active. Eleanor gently removed Alicia's hand from her arm. We'll just take a quick look. Stay here if you want. She stepped into the clearing, feeling the ground give slightly beneath her feet. It felt wrong somehow. Not muddy, but almost spongy. Mark followed reluctantly, his face tense. The air in the clearing was noticeably colder and carried a faint, unpleasant odor, something chemical and organic at the same time, like formaldehyde mixed with decay. There's something in the center, Mark said, pointing. In the middle of the clearing stood what appeared to be a crude stone marker, about 3 feet high. It wasn't a formal monument, more like a cairn of rocks that had been purposefully stacked and somehow fused together. They approached cautiously. The marker bore no inscription, but Eleanor noticed dark stains on the stones that didn't appear to be natural discoloration. Blood? Mark whispered. Before Eleanor could respond, thunder cracked directly overhead. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon had arrived with sudden fury. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, drenching them instantly. "We need to go now," Alicia shouted from the edge of the clearing, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Eleanor quickly took several photographs of the marker with her phone, then turned to leave. As she did, a flash of lightning illuminated the clearing and she froze. For just an instant, she thought she saw a figure standing at the opposite edge of the clearing, tall and unnaturally thin, wearing what looked like tattered, dark clothing. And though the distance was too great to make out details, she had the distinct impression that the figure was smiling. "Did you see that?" she gasped, grabbing Mark's arm. "See what?" he shouted over the storm, pulling her toward the trees where Alicia waited. Eleanor looked back, but in the now pouring rain, she could see nothing but the empty clearing and the solitary marker. They ran back to the van, slipping on the suddenly treacherous path. By the time they reached the vehicle, they were soaked and breathless. "I told you we shouldn't be there during a storm," Alicia said, as she started the engine, her hands visibly shaking. "We need to get back to the dock." As they drove through the downpour, Eleanor couldn't shake the image of the figure at the edge of the clearing. Had it been real, or just a trick of the lightning and her overwrought imagination? They reached the ferry dock with minutes to spare, the small boat pitching in the increasingly rough waters of the Sound. The captain looked doubtful as they approached. "Not sure we'll make it across in this weather," he warned them. "Might have to stay on the island tonight." "We have to get back," Eleanor insisted. "Our flight to Savannah leaves early tomorrow." After checking the latest weather report, the captain reluctantly agreed to make the crossing. "Stay inside the cabin," he instructed as they boarded. "This is going to be rough." The ferry ride was harrowing, the small vessel rising and falling alarmingly as waves crashed over its bow. Eleanor sat silently, clutching her tablet with the photographs she'd taken. Mark leaned close to her. "What did you see back there, in the clearing?" Eleanor hesitated, then opened her tablet and pulled up the last photo she'd taken, a hurried shot as she'd turned to leave. She zoomed in on the edge of the clearing opposite where they'd been standing. At first, there appeared to be nothing but rain and trees. But as she enhanced the image, a dark shape became visible, indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. "It could be anything," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A shadow, a tree trunk." Eleanor zoomed in further. The image became pixelated, but for a moment she thought she could make out a face and the suggestion of a wide, fixed grin. "We need to go back to the Historical Society in Savannah," she said quietly. "There's one more thing we need to check." The morning after their return from Sapello Island, Eleanor and Mark met at the Savannah Historical Society. Dr. Howard Blackwood greeted them with concern. "You both look exhausted," he observed. "Was your trip to Sapello informative?" "You could say that," Mark replied grimly, "though I'm not sure informative is the right word." Eleanor explained what they had discovered: Jacob Mercer's institutionalization rather than death, his transfer to Sapello Island, and the disturbing stories about the facility and the dead zone. Howard listened with increasing discomfort. "This is venturing far beyond historical research," he said when she had finished. "It sounds more like, well, Frankenstein folklore." "I know how it sounds," Eleanor admitted, "but there's something real behind these stories. Jacob Mercer was experimenting with reanimation in 1866. He apparently tested his methods on himself with disastrous results. And there's evidence he may have survived, in some form, well beyond when he should have died." Howard shook his head skeptically. "Even if his experiments cause some unusual physiological condition, no one lives for 150 years. Unless they found a way to cheat death," Eleanor countered. "In which case, what would that person look like after all this time? What would they become?" The director sighed heavily. "What exactly are you hoping to find here?" "Death records," Eleanor said. "Not for Jacob Mercer, but for unsolved deaths or disappearances in the Savannah area over the years, particularly during or after storms." Howard hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "We have police records and newspaper crime reports going back to the late 19th century, but it will take time to search through them all. We'll focus on specific periods," Eleanor said. "Starting with 1893, after the hurricane that damaged the Sapello facility." For the next several hours, they combed through archival newspapers and police records. By mid-afternoon, a disturbing pattern had emerged. "Look at this," Eleanor said, pointing to a timeline she had created. In November 1893, 2 months after the hurricane, 3 people disappeared from the docks in Savannah. Their bodies were found a week later with, quote, "unusual mutilations to the face and head." She pointed to another entry. Then, in 1912, during a major storm, a night watchman at Laurel Grove Cemetery reported seeing a tall, gaunt figure near the Wells family plot. The next morning, Catherine Wells's grave was found disturbed, though nothing was apparently taken. Mark added his own findings. "I found similar incidents in 1927, 1952, and 1979, all during major storms, all involving missing persons later found with facial mutilations, and all unsolved." Howard looked troubled. This could be coincidence, or perhaps copycat crimes inspired by local legends. Or it could be Jacob Mercer, still alive in some twisted form, still working on his experiments, Eleanor said quietly. "Think about it. He was obsessed with reanimation, with cheating death. What if he partially succeeded but needed to continue his research? What if he's been experimenting on victims for over a century?" "That's impossible," Howard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is there anything more recent?" Mark asked. "Any similar cases in the last few years?" Howard hesitated, then walked to his computer. There was something. He searched through digital news archives, then turned the screen toward them. Last year, during Hurricane Irma, 2 college students went missing from their apartment near Forsyth Park. They were found 3 days later in an abandoned building. The police report cited extreme facial trauma and evidence of surgical experimentation. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. Were there any suspects? Howard shook his head. None, but a witness reported seeing a tall, thin man near their apartment building during the height of the storm. The police sketch is here. The crude drawing showed a gaunt face with hollow cheeks and an unnaturally wide smile. It's him, Eleanor whispered. After all this time, Mark looked skeptical. Eleanor, we're building a horror story based on coincidences and local legends. There's no proof that Jacob Mercer is still alive, or that these crimes are connected to him. Then how do you explain the photograph? Eleanor demanded, pulling up the image of Jacob's grinning face in the coffin. How do you explain the empty grave, the sanitarium records, the stories from Sapello Island? How do you explain what I saw in the clearing? Before Mark could respond, Howard's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, then looked at Eleanor with concern. It's for you, he said, handing her the phone. Patricia Reeves from the University Archives. She says it's urgent. Eleanor took the phone. Patricia, what's wrong? The archivist's voice was tense, frightened. Dr. Hayes, someone broke into the archives last night. They specifically targeted the Wells family papers you were studying. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Were they stolen? No, Patricia replied, but they were examined. And I found something on my desk this morning, a note written on very old paper. What did it say? Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew. Patricia's voice trembled as she read, She knows too much. The work must continue. Tell her I'm coming. Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. Patricia, listen to me. Don't stay alone tonight. Go somewhere public, somewhere safe. What's going on? Patricia demanded. Who left that note? What does it mean? I don't know exactly, Eleanor lied. But please, just be careful. I'll explain everything soon. She ended the call and turned to Mark and Howard, her face pale. Someone knows what we've discovered. Someone who has access to very old paper and knew exactly what we were researching. You can't seriously believe it's Jacob Mercer, Mark protested, but his voice wavered. I don't know what I believe anymore, Eleanor admitted, but someone is watching us, someone connected to this case. Howard looked deeply troubled. Perhaps you should stop this investigation. If someone is threatening you... No, Eleanor said firmly. We're too close now. We need to find out what really happened to Jacob Mercer and whether he's connected to these deaths. She began gathering their research materials. There's a storm forecast for tonight. If the pattern holds, you think he'll strike again. Mark finished, his skepticism finally giving way to concern. Eleanor nodded grimly. And I think I know where he might go. The storm arrived with sudden fury just after sunset, lashing Savannah with wind and rain. Eleanor sat in her car outside Laurel Grove Cemetery, watching lightning illuminate the wrought iron gates. Mark had wanted to come with her, but she had convinced him to go to the police instead, taking copies of their research and the threatening note. She doubted the authorities would believe their theory about Jacob Mercer, but at least the evidence of a threat would be documented. The cemetery had closed at dusk, but Eleanor had discovered a gap in the fence during their previous visit. Pulling her raincoat tighter, she slipped through the opening and made her way toward the Wells family plot. Rain soaked through her clothes despite the coat, and thunder crashed overhead as she navigated between the gravestones. The beam of her flashlight seemed feeble against the darkness and the driving rain. When she reached Jacob Mercer's empty grave, she crouched behind a nearby mausoleum and waited, her heart pounding in her chest. Was she being reckless? Probably. But she needed answers, needed to know if the impossible could be true. Time passed slowly. Eleanor was beginning to think she had made a terrible mistake when a flash of lightning revealed a figure standing at the edge of the Wells family plot. tall, unnaturally thin, wearing what appeared to be a long, dark coat. Eleanor held her breath, pressing back against the cold stone of the mausoleum. The figure moved with a stiff, awkward gait to Catherine Wells' grave and stood motionless before the headstone. Gathering her courage, Eleanor stepped out from her hiding place, directing her flashlight beam at the figure. "Jacob Mercer!" she called, her voice nearly lost in the storm. The figure turned slowly. Eleanor gasped and nearly dropped her flashlight. The face that looked back at her was a grotesque parody of humanity, skin drawn tight over prominent bones, eyes sunken into dark hollows. But most disturbing was the mouth, fixed in a wide, rigid grin that exposed too many teeth. "You know my name," the figure said, its voice a rasping whisper that somehow carried over the storm. "You've been looking for me." Eleanor struggled to control her fear. "I found your photograph from your funeral. I know what you did to yourself." The figure, Mercer, tilted his head slightly, the grin never wavering. "My greatest success, and my eternal punishment." He took a step toward her, and Eleanor backed away instinctively. "You've been killing people," she said. "The missing persons, the mutilations, experiments," Mercer corrected, taking another step forward. "My work continues. It must continue. I am so close to understanding the error." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the unnatural angles of his body, the way his limbs seemed too long, too rigid. Eleanor realized with horror that Jacob Mercer was no longer fully human, if he had ever been. "You can't continue experimenting on innocent people," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've documented everything. The police know—" Mercer's laugh was a terrible sound, like dry branches scraping together. "The police? What do they know of my work? What could they possibly understand about the threshold between life and death?" He was closer now, close enough that Eleanor could smell the chemical odor that clung to him, the same smell she had noticed in the dead zone on Sapello Island. "My formula was flawed," Mercer continued, almost conversationally. "It prevented death but not decay, a partial success. The mind continues but the body—" He gestured at himself with a hand that seemed more like a claw. "The body becomes a prison." Eleanor's back hit a tombstone. She had nowhere left to retreat. "What do you want from me?" Mercer's grin seemed to widen, though Eleanor knew it was impossible. His facial muscles were frozen in that terrible smile. "A fresh subject," he said simply. "Someone who understands my work. Someone who can help me correct the formula." He lunged forward with surprising speed. Eleanor ducked and rolled aside, losing her flashlight in the process. She scrambled to her feet and ran blindly through the cemetery, rain and tears blinding her. Behind her, she could hear Mercer's uneven footsteps, relentless despite their awkwardness. Lightning flashed, showing her a path between the graves. She ran harder, her lungs burning. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness ahead. A car had pulled up to the cemetery gates. Eleanor changed direction, racing toward the light. "Help!" she screamed, though she knew her voice couldn't carry over the storm. The cemetery gates were locked, but Eleanor reached the fence and began to climb, ignoring the pain as the metal cut into her hands. Behind her, Mercer was approaching, his unnatural grin visible even in the darkness. As she reached the top of the fence, a familiar voice called her name. Mark stood by the car, his face illuminated by the headlights. "Eleanor, hurry!" She dropped to the ground outside the fence and ran to the car. Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the vehicle. "He's here!" she gasped. "Jacob Mercer, he's real." "I know," Mark said grimly. "The police found something in the archives. Catherine Wells' private journal. She documented everything. Jacob's experiments, his transformation, how they tried to contain him." Eleanor looked back at the fence. A tall figure stood just beyond the light's reach, watching them. "Get in the car," Mark ordered, opening the passenger door. "The police are on their way." As Eleanor slid into the seat, the figure beyond the fence suddenly moved, scaling the metal barrier with inhuman agility. "Drive!" Eleanor shouted as Mercer dropped to the ground outside the cemetery. Mark jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning on the wet pavement. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Eleanor saw Mercer walking toward them, unhurried now, as if certain they couldn't escape. The car's tires found traction, and they shot backward. Then Mark spun the wheel and shifted into drive. As they accelerated away, Eleanor looked in the side mirror. Jacob Mercer stood in the middle of the road, his frozen grin visible even through the darkness and rain. He raised one hand in what almost seemed like a farewell. "He'll come after us," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "He's been doing this for over a century. He won't stop." Mark reached over and squeezed her hand. "The police know everything now. They've sent units to secure the university archives and your apartment. We'll be safe." Eleanor wasn't convinced. "You don't understand. He's not human anymore, not really. How do you stop something that can't die?" As they drove through Savannah's rain-lashed streets, Eleanor couldn't shake the image of Jacob Mercer's grinning face, the same grin she had first seen in a photograph taken 159 years ago at a funeral for a man who hadn't died. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that they hadn't seen the last of the Savannah grin. Eleanor and Mark spent the night at a police station, giving statements and reviewing evidence with increasingly skeptical detectives. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies and skeptical law enforcement. "Let me get this straight," Detective Wilson said, rubbing his tired eyes. "You believe this 19th century doctor discovered a formula that prevents death, tested it on himself, and has been killing people during storms for over a century to continue his experiments?" Put that way, Eleanor had to admit it sounded ridiculous. "I know how it sounds," she said, "but we saw him. And there's evidence, the pattern of killings, the sanitarium records, Catherine Wells' journal." "We've read the journal," Wilson interrupted. "It's the ramblings of a woman clearly suffering from delusions after her brother's death. As for what you saw in the cemetery," he shrugged, "stress, fear, and a powerful storm can play tricks on the mind." "What about the break-in at the archives?" Mark asked. "The threatening note?" "We're investigating that," Wilson assured them, "but there's no evidence connecting it to these historical murders you've compiled. More likely someone trying to scare you off for disturbing old graves or violating some academic protocol." Eleanor could see they weren't going to be taken seriously. "What happens now?" "We'll keep officers posted at your apartment today," Wilson said. "But honestly, I think you two should get some rest and perspective. You've been immersed in disturbing historical research for too long." They left the station as the city was coming to life, cleanup crews already clearing storm debris from the streets. "They think we're crazy," Eleanor said as they walked to Mark's car. "Can you blame them?" Mark replied, though without mockery. "I'd think we were crazy too if I hadn't seen whatever that was with my own eyes." Eleanor stopped walking. "You believe me now? You believe it was Jacob Mercer?" Mark hesitated. "I believe we saw something that shouldn't be possible, whether it's actually a 160-year-old doctor kept alive by his own experiments." He shook his head. "I don't know, but I know you're not crazy, and neither am I." He unlocked his car. "Let's get you home. You need sleep." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I need to see Catherine's journal for myself, the complete journal, not just the excerpts the police showed us." Mark looked uncertain. "Eleanor, we've been up all night." "We're exhausted, not thinking clearly." "Jacob Mercer is still out there," Eleanor interrupted. "He knows who I am, knows what I've discovered, and he's been killing for over a century without being caught. Do you really think a few skeptical police officers will stop him?" After a moment, Mark nodded reluctantly. "The journal should still be at the archives. Patricia said it was found in a hidden compartment in one of the Wells family document boxes. When they arrived at the university archives, they found the building closed, with police tape across the entrance. A single officer stood guard, looking bored. "Now what?" Mark whispered as they observed from their car. Eleanor thought for a moment. "Patricia has keys. And she knows we're not crazy. She received the threatening note herself." A quick phone call confirmed that Patricia was at home, shaken by the previous night's events, but willing to help. They drove to her small bungalow in a quiet neighborhood near the university. Patricia Reeves looked like she had slept as little as they had, her eyes red-rimmed and anxious. "The police think I'm overreacting," she said as she led them into her living room. "They said the break-in was probably just students looking for test answers." "Did you tell them about the note?" Eleanor asked. Patricia nodded. "They took it as evidence, but I could tell they thought it was a prank." She hesitated, then added, "But it wasn't the only thing I found." She went to a drawer and removed a small, leather-bound book. "I didn't show this to the police. I was afraid they'd confiscate it, and something told me you needed to see it first." Eleanor took the book with trembling hands. "Catherine Wells' journal." "A second journal," Patricia corrected, "hidden even more carefully than the first. This one spans from 1866 to 1878, covering the years immediately after Jacob's death and institutionalization." Eleanor opened the journal carefully, the leather crackling with age. Catherine's handwriting was small and precise, filling every page with observations and reflections. The early entries confirmed what they already knew: Jacob's experiments with reanimation, his self-testing of the formula, the disastrous results, and the decision to fake his death and commit him to the sanitarium. But as they read further, more disturbing details emerged. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, reading from an entry dated December 1868. "Jacob's condition worsens. Dr. Sullivan reports that his physical deterioration has slowed almost to a halt, but the changes to his mind are accelerating. He no longer recognizes me, speaks of himself in the third person, and refers constantly to the work that must continue. Most disturbing are the diagrams he draws, modifications to his formula that Sullivan believes would be even more dangerous than the original. I have instructed Sullivan to burn all such papers." Mark leaned closer to see the journal. She knew how dangerous he was becoming. Eleanor turned more pages, stopping at an entry from July 1871, shortly after Jacob's transfer to Sapello Island. "Colonel Harrison assures me the facility on Sapello is escape-proof, with guards posted day and night. Jacob will receive humane care, but can no longer be allowed any materials for his research. I pray this ends the nightmare, though I fear it is too late for my brother's soul. The thing that wears his face is no longer Jacob." The final entries were the most chilling. In October 1878, Catherine wrote, "I received word today that there was an incident at the Sapello facility. Jacob attacked a guard, attempting to remove the man's facial muscles with improvised tools. When subdued, he was heard repeating, 'The formula requires fresh specimens. The work must continue. Colonel Harrison recommends more extreme containment measures, a specially constructed underground chamber with iron restraints.' I have reluctantly approved this, though it breaks my heart to imagine Jacob confined in such a place. But I cannot ignore the truth any longer. My brother died the day he took his formula. What remains is something else, something that must never be allowed to continue his work." The journal ended abruptly after that entry. Eleanor closed it gently, her mind racing. "She knew," she whispered. "She knew he had become something inhuman. But she still couldn't bring herself to destroy him," Mark observed. "Family loyalty, or hope that he could somehow be cured." Patricia, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "There's something else you should see." She handed Eleanor a folded piece of paper. "This fell out of the journal. It's not Catherine's handwriting." Eleanor unfolded the yellowed paper carefully. The handwriting was jagged, urgent, and somehow familiar, similar to Jacob's letter that they had found earlier, but more deranged, the letters sprawling across the page. "Sister, if you read this, I have escaped. Do not seek me. Do not tell others of me. The work continues. It must continue. Each storm brings clarity. Each subject brings progress. What you think of as Jacob is gone. I am more now. I am the formula incarnate, life without end, consciousness without peace. I will perfect my creation, and when I do, you will be the first to receive my gift. Until then, I remain your loving brother." The note was undated, but a notation in different handwriting at the bottom read, "Found on my doorstep, November 15th, 1893. God help us all. C.W." "And 2 months after the hurricane that destroyed the Sapello facility," Eleanor said quietly, "and right around when the first Savannah murders began," Mark added. Patricia looked between them, her academic skepticism finally giving way to fear. "You really believe Jacob Mercer is still alive, still killing people?" "I believe something is still alive," Eleanor replied. "Something that was once Jacob Mercer, before he transformed himself into," she struggled to find the right words, "into a living embodiment of his own flawed formula." Mark stood up and began pacing. "So what do we do now? The police don't believe us. We have historical evidence, but nothing that would convince them this is a current threat." Eleanor thought for a moment, then turned to Patricia. "We need to find Jacob's original research notes. Catherine mentioned that Dr. Sullivan was supposed to burn them, but what if he didn't? What if he kept copies? After 160 years? Patricia looked doubtful. Even if they survived, where would they be? Sullivan was Jacob's friend and colleague, Eleanor said, thinking aloud. He helped cover up what happened. He might have kept the notes somewhere secure, somewhere associated with medical research. Mark stopped pacing. The old Savannah Medical College. It was operating in the 1860s, and Sullivan might have had access. The building is still standing, Patricia confirmed. It's part of the historic district now, mostly used for offices and tourism. Eleanor stood up, her fatigue temporarily forgotten. We need to search that building. If we can find Jacob's original notes, maybe we can understand what he did to himself, and maybe find a way to stop him. Stop him? Mark repeated. Eleanor, even if we find the notes, what exactly are you planning to do? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Whatever happened to Jacob Mercer in 1866, it trapped him in a state between life and death. He's been suffering for over a century, Mark, and he's made countless others suffer as well. You want to kill him, Patricia said quietly, to end his existence. I want to free him, Eleanor corrected. And yes, that probably means finding a way to reverse what he did, to allow him to finally die. Mark looked unconvinced. And how exactly do we do that? We're historians, not medical researchers or monster hunters. We start by understanding what he did to himself, Eleanor replied. Jacob's notes might tell us that, and they might tell us his weakness. Outside, clouds were beginning to gather again on the horizon. Another storm approaching. Eleanor felt a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. We need to go now, she said, before the storm hits, before he comes looking for us again.